Okay, I'm good.
All right. Well, welcome. I'd like to introduce Dr. David Etkin. He's going to talk about some risk assessment, and he's going to give us a presentation. It's going to be more of a, well, he's going to present to us, but I'm going to ask questions throughout to give more of a discussionary as well. So you'll be able to ask, I'll be asking questions, he'll be answering questions in the midst of giving his presentation. Towards the end, what we're going to do as well is we're going to give you some information on where you could go find Dr. Etkin, and some of he has also an author of a book, so we'll talk a little bit about the book. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thanks very much. So I guess I'll share screen and just get started on the presentation then.
Sure.
Share screen. Are you seeing my screen okay?
Yep, all good. I'm going to shut my camera off.
Okay, so I'm basically going to talk about risk assessment, specifically the way it's done by emergency management organizations. And I know Dan wanted to address the area of mitigation, but risk assessment is the basis of mitigation strategies. So I think that is the relevance to his topic. The primary sources for this talk are these three papers, all in risk assessment, and so they're all available in the journals at your local academic library if you feel like reading more about it. Also, feel free to email me if you have any questions or interested in it. My email is etkin@yorku.ca. So these are the main thoughts I would like you to take away from this presentation. One is that risk assessments are underlain by values that are rarely, if ever, explicitly stated. And these values are important because depending on what they are, it will greatly affect the outcome of a risk assessment process. Rare events, just because of the nature of disaster statistics, rare events are really important in a risk assessment. So if for some reason your risk assessment is not including, the really unlikely things that might happen, but yet have a lot of impact, then the chances are you're greatly underestimating risk. And I just have a little video here of some guy who greatly underestimated risk that I thought you might enjoy. One of those papers was a review of how emergency management organizations have done risk assessments. And basically I would say like a lot of them were really badly done. They're not alone in this. I think broadly within the field of risk assessment, there are some serious methodological problems that are popping up in a lot of disciplines. But emergency management organizations, which are the ones I really looked at, clearly there are a lot of problems that should be fixed, and it's an important topic. And the other main point I want you to take away is there's no such thing as a unique equation that defines what risk is. It's like the Holy Grail. People say, okay, I just have to find the right equation, and then I've got the answer. But there is no one answer. There's no Holy Grail. There's no one equation that is the right equation. And the best way to think of risk is kind of a mosaic of many factors that requires presentations that can display, the multiplicity of perspectives. So those are the main takeaways. So let's look at the first one, which is just values and how they can impact a risk assessment. So I just want to ask you a question. And Dan, I'm going to ask, since I've got you as a victim here, I'm going to ask you to answer it. Which is a larger risk if both have an equal probability of occurrence? Loss of $100,000 or the loss of $1 million?
Well, common sense would want me to say the loss of $1 million.
Of course. And obviously I'm setting you up, right?
Yes, you are.
But that's okay. I know you won't mind. But suppose the loss of $100,000 was to a widow with a disabled child whose total wealth is, say, $110,000. The loss of $1 million happened to a single person with no dependents who has $1 billion. How would you answer the question then?
It would be the 100,000.
100,000. So I'm just trying to here show the importance of context and metrics when we're assessing risk. We see this problem when we see tables of how risks are ranked. And in virtually every risk ranking exercise, one of the metrics that is used is the total cost of the disaster. So here's one example of about 4 disasters with a total cost, range from in millions of dollars, 210,000 down to 8,000. But if we think of that as a percentage of GDP, and this is similar to the previous one, like how much wealth does a person have, we can see the answers are quite different. So, for example, the 2011 Japanese tsunami, as a percentage of Japan's GDP, it was 3.6. But if we look at the Haiti earthquake, it was 121% of GDP. And so depending upon the metric that you choose, let's say total cost versus some sort of normalized value, like cost as a percentage of GDP, you'll get very different outcomes in your risk ranking. And this represents a perspective and set of values that are injected into risk assessments that really need to be acknowledged, because when you rank things, you say, okay, we need to put the most resources to our greatest risk. But if your metric is total cost, you're orienting that ranking in one direction. And in fact, you cannot meaningfully rank them unless you know what values are important to you in the exercise. So risk metrics are value laden. If you are looking at total costs, it will focus on the wealthy and the elite. Normalized costs will focus on the poor and the vulnerable. So when I was looking at all kinds of risk ranking exercises by different organizations and different papers, virtually all I ever saw was total costs, which means that methodological process that's built into the way risk assessment is done and exercised and applied tends to support existing hegemonies of power and wealth, and not the poor and vulnerable. Although, in every emergency management organization, we talk about how we have to focus on them, but in terms of risk assessment, really, to say they're second-class citizens is, I think, pretty accurate. So one of the initial aspects, in my opinion, of how a risk assessment needs to be done is to have an ethical analysis where you say, okay, these are our values. This is the ethical basis of the risk assessment. These are the metrics we're choosing, and these are the reasons why. So you have to ask yourself the question, who is doing the risk ranking? What is the context? Who is it for what hazards, and for what purpose? And it's not that one way is wrong and another way is right. It's a question of understanding the methodology and the context of the risk assessment so you can properly interpret the results.
So I have a quick question on that
Yes.
as well. So what we see is it's not that the wealthy are not affected by disaster. They're just not affected to the same extent as those who live, as you mentioned here, poor or vulnerable. But with mitigation or the proper teaching of mitigation, we could not mitigate, if not prevent, some of the effect that it has on both class, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's really a question of transparency and honesty and understanding what these metrics that we're using mean. So there might be lots of examples where, say, you absolutely want to look at total costs. And maybe it's for a disaster financial assistance program by the federal government for the provinces and states or something like that. They want to look at their potential liability in terms of fiscal transfers and so forth. But if you're thinking of a social vulnerability perspective, a risk assessment for that purpose would be better off using normalized costs to focus on the poor and vulnerable. So it's really all about what you are doing the risk assessment for. Do you want to reduce total cost? Sure, you want to do that, but you don't want to necessarily do it at the expense of the poor and vulnerable suffering disproportionately. Did that answer your question okay?
You did, yes, thank you.
Um, so obviously there's financial impacts, which are an important part of risk assessments, but then there's the question of people dying and being harmed. And then the whole question of value of life, like how do you financially value life? There's a whole big literature on that. So if I can ask you, how much is a human life worth in dollars? And this is called the statistical value of life. There are two basic approaches to talking to the value of life. One is descriptive in nature. And the descriptive approach, which is what the statistical value of life is, basically says, okay, let's take a look at society and how much they spend. Like, what do we actually do? And that comes under the area of descriptive ethics. And then the other side of it is normative ethics, which is not just how much societies actually spend in dollars and this, that, and the other thing, but how much, what's our value ought we to give people's lives? And in fact, can you even, in a more sort of metaphysical or meta-ethical question would be, can you even express the value of life in terms of dollars? But there's a large literature on the economic value of life, and we have to answer questions like, are all lives of equal value? How would you answer that question, Dan? Are all lives of equal value?
Ultimately, I believe so. But when you look at it in the economic sense, which I think is where you're going, they're not. But I'm trying to recall some a class I took where you can't put money on the cost of a human life because you can't replace human life. But in order for metric to work properly, you have to put a number on there, and per life it's like $6 million or something like that. I'm totally messing that number up from the course that I took a couple of years back.
Yeah.
But yeah, ultimately, yeah, I believe all lives are of equal value, but their worth is where we get caught up.
It's a horribly difficult question. It's a normative value in society that all lives are of equal value. And that's what people will generally say. Yes, I'm going to say all lives are of equal value. Like, personally, I don't go there. I think it's not necessarily true, but we'll get to that more in a minute. And another question, are there special duties to some people or groups? And that may not be represented in a risk analysis as well, but could still indicate, could still affect how resources are allocated and decisions that are made around mitigation or prevention and so forth. And that is something that may not appear in a risk analysis but would be part of an ethical analysis. Just to go back to the question we're asking, the value of lives. So if we use that descriptive approach and take a look at the VSL for different countries. So the left-hand chart, the VSL is the value of a statistical life. And it shows for a bunch of different countries what those values are and compares it to the GDP per capita. And basically what it shows is that in wealthier countries, people's lives are worth more. And again, this is in the sense of how those societies allocate funds, okay, in terms of protecting people, in high-risk jobs, for example. So the US is way up there. I'm not sure where Canada is, but it's probably somewhere close to the US. Norway is pretty high, Switzerland, but if you get to very poor countries or struggling countries like Thailand, Brazil, Greece, those lives financially are just worth much less using this particular approach. On the right-hand chart, it again shows the value of a statistical life. And this is based upon US data, not global country data, but shows a series of studies, the value of statistical life on the y-axis compared to annual occupational mortality risk per 1,000 workers. And what it shows is that where there is a higher risk, where more people die, in those occupations, the value of statistical life is less. So it's basically a fireman makes a lot less than, say, a hedge fund manager, for example. Hedge fund manager makes a lot more money, but the risk of them dying in their job is a lot less, and therefore the value of statistical life is much higher for them. So I remember after September 11th, 2001, there was, for example, monies paid out to people. I'm not sure I'm going to get this exactly right, but the firemen who went in, for example, and died trying to save people, you could say, okay, what is their life worth compared to a stockbroker who's in the building and wasn't acting in an altruistic way to save other people's lives, but basically in the market to make a lot of money? Is that fireman's life worth a lot less than the stockbroker's life? And if you take this statistical approach, the answer is yes. Although intuitively that just doesn't feel right.
Yeah.
To me anyway. So
I have a quick question on that, because,
sure. Yeah.
and this is one of those areas, working in and it's a mitigated, measure as well when it comes to life insurance or insurance and property and valuables, and how you measure that, and how you put a cost on the life that you potentially are insuring. And we just mentioned, with life insurance, and some of this is what you're showing here. They utilize these metrics when they decide whether or not they're going to insure you or not, based on how long they believe you're going to live. And if you are in a high dangerous or more dangerous of a job, it may mean your premiums go up, or they won't insure you because you're more likely to die and they're going to have to pay money. Well, how does that work when it comes to the way, with like myself, with the initiative of driving mitigation and preaching mitigation and wanting people to take action when they can't necessarily afford it, based on the value or the metrics that are being used in our current system?
So that's a good question, and I don't think there's any easy answer to it. I think one part of it might be in terms of what metrics you are selecting when you try and make these kinds of decisions. So I'm going to do a little tangent here. There's a huge literature on risk assessment, and that whole literature, the bulk of it developed, I would say, after World War II, although it goes back to the late 1800s from insurance companies. And that discipline, which goes across, various intellectual histories, I would say, essentially emerged from engineering and finance and insurance. So that is where the literature on risk assessment essentially came from. And so it absorbed those cultures and kind of had this economic, financial perspective on what it is. There's also a huge literature on ethical decision making. And that goes back thousands of years, as far back as we have of records. So like the ancient Greeks, like Aristotle and Socrates, for example, would talk about this. And to me, it seems like they are two sides of the same coin. Ethical decision-making and risk assessment. And yet, if you look at the literature and, for example, a number of papers that have published that overlap both of those, it's infinitesimal. There are very few papers that have tried to combine those two to look at it. And historically, those two intellectual disciplines have operated in parallel without a lot of interaction. And I think one of the challenges of our time right now is to try and merge those to a much greater extent. There's so much good work that's been done on both sides. And I think those literatures and those perspectives need to just cross-fertilize each other a lot more. Risk assessment is an important tool, but as a methodology and a tool to make decisions, it's insufficient. And we have to expand beyond that very useful and very necessary, but limited methodology to incorporate other aspects as well. So that's a whole nother discussion. So this question, are all lives of equal value? Like, I would say no. A philanthropist who goes around saving lives and helping people, I would rate as that person's life having a lot more value than, say, a murderer or a psychopathic scam artist who steals money from elderly disabled people. Like, that's, for me, that's a no-brainer. That's just my emotional, intuitive response. But I know, and this goes back to like divine law and faith-based perspectives, that all lives are of equal value. And so I think we all struggle with that tension there. Like, on the one hand, we want to say, yes, all lives are of equal value. On the other hand, some people certainly seem to be a lot better than other people. And I think that's a struggle I have anyway. And then there's the issue of special duties. And even if all lives are equal value, even if you take that perspective, you can still argue that there are special duties that exist to some individuals or groups, such as children, wards of the state, and so forth. So if you're a governmental organization and there are people like in, say, orphanages or prisons or old age homes or whatever, you have special duties to those people, which would justify giving extra attention to them in terms of, say, mitigation or prevention strategies or response, for example, as compared to others to whom duties are lesser. Is that accounted for in risk analysis or mitigation strategies? Maybe sometimes it is, but I think a lot of times it's not. And again, when you create a methodology for risk assessment or risk analysis, and if that's forming the basis of mitigation strategies, you really have to ask yourself the question, okay, what is missing from this risk assessment, and how is that going to impact, the kind of decisions I make down the road? So in terms of risk assessment, the next thing I wanted to talk about was rare events. So if you look at that red curve there, the normal distribution called the bell curve, we all grew up seeing that. We were in school and our grades were bell curved. We've all, had that experience. As a matter of fact, in our undergraduate program where I teach, we apply that. We take the distribution and approximately normalize it so things don't get too out of whack. And to have an understanding of this distribution is very useful. So if you want to know, let's say, if you ask, what's the average grade of a student in the course, which say be the mean, and if you know the standard deviation, which is kind of the width of that bell curve, then you have a lot of good information about the population, okay? And people tend to think in terms of normal distributions. It's kind of how we were educated. It's very, very useful. But there are other kinds of distributions that are not normal distributions. There's another distribution, which is called a fat tail distribution. And the power law is one example of that. Has a different equation describing it. And it just doesn't look anything like the bell curve. Disaster data does not fit a normal distribution. Disaster data tends to fit typically a power law distribution. And that has important consequences in terms of the metrics that we use and understanding what it means. So just for example, I say most disaster data is fat-tailed. So that power law is an example of a fat-tailed one. For an average, or so for a normal distribution, if you know the mean or the expected value, that's very helpful. And again, so if you look at that graph on the right, you have the mean, median, and mode. And if it's a perfect normal distribution, they're all the same. If it's somewhat skewed, they're not exactly the same, but you still have a good sense for what the distribution of data is like. On the other hand, for disasters, it's just not helpful to talk about averages. It's misleading to calculate expected values as part of a risk assessment because the distribution is just so different. So for a power law, if I say, what is the average in the data, for example, which is the red dot on the screen there, that doesn't give you a whole lot of useful information. For a normal distribution, if you know the average, you would expect most events to be clustered around the mean. But this is not true about the power law. And I'll show an example of how some of the equations used in risk analysis fall into that trap of using expected values to calculate risk, which would work for normal distributions, but doesn't work for power law distributions. Where the distributions of a power law, where that's the case, like for disasters, one extreme event is just much more likely to totally alter your statistics. So say, for example, you looked at deaths from earthquakes, and you did the calculation before the Haiti earthquake, and then after the Haiti earthquake, you would just have a very, very different answer because that one event would skew the data so much. Where you have power law distributions like disaster data, the impact of a single event can be very powerful. It's likely to be much more important than it is in a normal distribution. So if you're not including the very rare events in the cumulative impact of risks, if they're excluded for some reason, then the chances are your analysis is underestimating risk in a very significant way. Whereas if it's a normal distribution, that's probably not the case.
So can I ask, how would we utilize the information of what happened over the last year and a half with COVID and the record-breaking fires and the freezes and the storms that came through without having real, I guess, processed research and data to help us with performing a risk assessment of this type?
Of course, you have to have all the data. My answer to that is, especially if your data set is not very large, which is often the case, then you have to look at the statistics with the jaundiced eye. Let's say, okay, cats. Are you afraid of pussycats? You're probably not afraid of pussycats. Their mean value for weight is maybe 12 or 14 pounds or something like that. Some are smaller, some are bigger. So I can walk down the street and not be worried about meeting a cat because there aren't going to be any cats out there that are, probably going to bother me. Assuming a tiger didn't get out of the zoo or something. I'm just talking about house cats. So cats have a normal distribution for size. But let's say their size followed a power law distribution. Then I would have to be concerned because I would go out and be surrounded by thousands of cats that had the weight around, say, 10 or 12 pounds, say the bulk of them. Then all of a sudden I turn the corner and there'd be a 150-pound cat. And I'd have to be worried. So that is the difference between a normal distribution and a power law distribution. In a power law distribution, you really have to think about those rare events because they just come up a lot more frequently than you would expect as compared to if you're thinking of it with a normal distribution. So it makes statistical analysis a lot more complicated because your calculations from the data are not nearly as stable because depending whether or not there happens to be a large event there, your data will be sort of skewed in one direction or another. That's why it's important in risk analyses to think about worst case scenarios, not just what has happened, but what might happen, and to include those in the risk analysis. And I know it's very hard to do that. It's complicated and uncomfortable, but if you're not doing it, then you're narrowing your risk analysis in a way that will really underestimate your risk. So when we talk about disaster risk, it's really a function of the hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. And I just want to show a little bit of data as to uh, why disasters are follow power law instead of normal distribution. So, for example, this is an example of earthquake risk. So it shows the number of occurrences of earthquake at different magnitudes. And you can see the distribution is not normal. It really follows power law kind of distribution. We can take a look at, say, city populations. So this is an exposure kind of issue. And if you do look at a histogram of city populations, again, you see that it doesn't follow a normal distribution. You have huge numbers of cities with low populations, and then a much smaller number of cities with high populations, but you have a few out there which are really huge, and the really big meta cities contribute a significant fraction to total population. Another interesting way of looking at this sort of data is to rank order it. And of the two graphs that showed up with the blue dots, the one on the left side has rank ordered data. So what it shows is the city size and population, that's millions of people, and then the rank. So the very top one, for example, on the y-axis, which is about at 37. So that is your largest population city, Tokyo. This is 2010 data, has 37 million people. Then your next one was Shanghai at around 27 million people. And you have a relatively small number of events clustered up here at the top of the y-axis here, right, say 1 to 10, that actually account for a significant part of the total population of all the cities. And then it goes rapidly down to populations which are relatively low, say 1 million or less. And that is where the huge bulk of your cities go out to, over 4,000. And so when you have, this kind of fat tail distribution, and if you rank order it, you see a distribution like that, which is very different from what you get with, again, a normalized curve. And finally, in terms of vulnerability, just to illustrate this, I just found some data on the share of national income by the top 1% and the bottom 50%. And this is US data. And it's changed a bit over time. If you go back to, say, 1980, which is the left hand of the graph, the top 1% of the US had maybe 10 or 11% of total income, which is a lot since they're only 1%. And then the bottom 50% of the US had maybe 20 or 21% of the data. Over time, that's been changing. So this fat tail has been getting fatter. And as of 2015, the top 1% had about 20% of the data, it doubled, whereas the bottom 50% only had about, say, 13% of the wealth. And this kind of inequity is an example of a fat tail. That is, a lot of the wealth is held by few people. I can't remember exactly. I read a statistic about like the top 10 or 12 richest people in the world and what percentage of global wealth they owned or controlled. I can't remember what the data was, but I remember being shocked by how much it was. So that's another example of a fat tail distribution. When we're talking about disaster risk, if you have an equation for it, basically you're multiplying hazard times exposure times vulnerability. And each of those components has aspects of it which are fat-tailed. And that's basically why disasters, if you actually take a look at what happens, they're fat-tailed.
Well, this would relate too to, and I teach this when I talk to people, is that, hazards and risks that exist out there are just that. They're just hazards and risks, but they're not disasters until they affect the human population. So when you have a large population affected by a disaster, you have more people in the midst of that disaster or that hazard or risk that then turns it into a disaster because it affects human population. Is this kind of where these numbers play?
That's absolutely true. And the whole area of sort of vulnerability theory emphasizes that. The point I'm trying to make with this is that in a risk analysis, if you're not including the rare events, you do not have a good risk analysis. But including the very rare events is extraordinarily challenging. For when it's really hard to know what the probability is, it's hard to know what their consequences are, and there are emotional and political reasons why they're unpalatable to people to include them. For example, you might say, well, this, we can't even deal with this, so why even think about it or plan for it at an emotional level. And politicians might say, well, it's so unlikely I'm not going to worry about it in my 4-year term of office or something like that. So this people's emotions, their cognitive processes by which they try and assess risk, and politics all work towards not including those rare events in a risk analysis. And yet it's very important to do so. So it's kind of almost a barrier to a good risk analysis, doing them. Like you might want to include it and you might not even know how to do it. And if you're not too sure about the probability of the consequences, when you start multiplying those two things together, then you end up with unstable calculations mathematically. So even statistically and mathematically, it's hard to deal with. And to try and take a quantitative approach to those sorts of those aspects of risk analysis or dealing with those sorts of threats is unsatisfying. And I think you really have to switch to a more precautionary principle kind of discussion. So I thought I'd make a few points about risk matrices because they are a common way that is used to understand and assess risk. And they're very useful. I think they're great, but there are also some issues and traps associated with them. So for example, how do you unpack impact? So that gets into some things I've talked about before. What metrics do you use? Do you use like total economic impact, or do you normalize it? How do you rank number of deaths versus financial costs or cultural impacts or other things that are important to a society? So unpacking impact can be really, really complicated. And these things are often done where it's a simple multiplication by likelihood and impact. So when you do that, let's say a likelihood is 1 and an impact is 10, that's 10. Reverse it. Let's say the likelihood is 10 and the impact is 1, that's 10 as well. So if you use a simple multiplicative kind of formula, what you're doing is creating an equivalency between low probability, high impact events and high probability, low impact events. And there's a real problem with doing that. So the problem with it is that if you have something that happens all the time, frequently, but it's not a very big impact, society can continue and cope with it. Whereas if you have a very rare event with just catastrophic impact, then society can just sort of fall apart and not deal with it. So even though one occurs much more often than the other, it's just not the same kind of thing, even though 1 times 10 equals 10 times 1. It's like, let's say you have a population of 1,000 people and you lose, say 100 people a year on average, and 100 people are born, and it's in a year, and it's no big deal, balances off. And that happens year after year. That's a higher probability, low impact, happens all the time. But suppose that wasn't happening, all of a sudden you have one huge event which wiped out your entire population. So mathematically, those two things might be equivalent, but in one case you have sustainability, in the other case you have extinction, which are quite different.
Yeah.
So I'm just making the point that if you create that equivalence there in your formulas and using those formulas, then there's a false equivalence. And then there's the whole issue of critical thresholds, which tend not to show up here, and the way granularity is lost during aggregation or averaging. So I'll just talk a little bit about critical thresholds. So this is an example of a critical threshold. I'm just going to fast forward a bit. So everything was fine until all of a sudden it wasn't fine. And if we look at all kinds of, say, engineering structures, where we have building codes that say, okay, we're going to design to a 100-year return period for whatever it happens to be. Maybe it's snow load, wind load, maybe it's flood risk or whatever. We have what are called fragility curves, and engineers use this. And what they will do will come up with a graph saying, okay, we're going to be just fine up to a point, and that's our maybe our design load. And then when we get to that, we're going to start having failures. Those failures will increase in probability rapidly until everything fails. And where this threshold, where this critical load, where it exists is a really important number. And if you really want to understand the vulnerability of a community or a social system, whatever, you need to understand these kind of critical thresholds. And if you look at sort of the insurance and reinsurance companies and the catastrophe programs they run to estimate what the risk is, they use curves like this to try and understand it. And if you're in using a risk matrix approach, the chances are you're not incorporating where your critical thresholds are, in those estimates. That would be in part in terms of how you unpack impact. So you can have, for example, low vulnerability and high resilience up to a critical threshold. And then once you pass that threshold, all of a sudden your vulnerability skyrockets, your resilience drops like a rock, potentially, and you're just in a very different scenario. There's just an example of a critical threshold. Everything was fine until you reach a critical threshold, and then the roof blows off. I'm not sure I got it. Okay, so actually, I just want to go back. I'll say something about how granularity is lost during aggregation or averaging. So in many risk assessments, we'll come up with a whole bunch of individual risk components and then go create an average or a total in order to have a metric that says this is what your risk is and compare it to maybe somebody else's risk. But there could be individual elements there where important information is lost. And just to explain that, suppose, Dan, you got let's say there are 50 vitamins that you need in your diet. And unless you have at least 80% of all those vitamins, let's say if you have 80% of all the vitamins, you're going to do pretty well. But let's say you have 90% of all of them, okay? And we use that as your metric. Then if they were all at 90%, then you're going to have a score of 90% and you're doing really well and you're healthy. Just take another case. Let's say of all those 50 vitamins that you need, let's say you get 100% of 49 of them, okay? And let's say there's one, say vitamin C, where you don't get 90% of it, you don't get 50% of it, maybe you're down at 10%. Your average score is going to be really, really high, higher than 90% than in the first case. Or if you take a total instead of an average, it's still going to be very, very high. And yet you're going to get scurvy, your teeth are going to fall out, your legs are going to bow, and eventually you're going to die a painful death. Okay. So when we actually calculate risk, it is critical not to lose important information through process of aggregation and averaging. And some risk assessments fall into that trap and some don't, but it's just a point I'm trying to make that if you do get into risk assessment, to try and come up with one single number, which policymakers might really like, but if you do that, then it's not necessarily a good presentation of what risk is, and the picture of risk that's presented needs to be much more granular and much more robust than just a single number. Okay, so when I did a review, this is just a few years ago, along with a colleague of mine, Ada Mamuji at York University, we took a look at the actual risk equations that were used by all the provinces in Ontario, or sorry, in Canada, by all the states in the United States, and maybe about a half dozen national level risk assessments. And we found a large variance in how they calculated risk. And these are places that actually did mathematical calculations and used it. So there were a number of emergency management organizations that added hazard and vulnerability, and there were a number that multiplied them. Multiplying is correct, adding is incorrect. And I know where this came from. There was a book called At Risk, which had a huge influence on how risk is understood and viewed within the emergency management community. In the first edition, there was a model presented, the risk model, which had the equation risk equals hazard plus vulnerability. And that kind of got out in the literature. It weaved its way through the practice of organizations. In the second edition, they realized they made an error and corrected it to multiplication sign instead of a plus sign. But there's still that notion that you can add hazard and vulnerability instead of multiplying them mathematically to understand or to estimate risk. Just to illustrate why that's wrong, suppose you have a hazard, and let's say you're doing it on a scale from 0 to 10. And let's say the hazard is little green men from Mars getting in a bunch of spaceships and coming to Earth with their super ray guns and killing off human species. Let's say that's the hazard. The vulnerability, and that includes exposure. Exposure is implicit in vulnerability. The vulnerability, the exposure is 0 because the hazard doesn't exist. Okay. So, so if you're adding them, you have 10 plus 0, which is 10. And if you're doing both in scale 1 to 10, and the worst risk you can get is 20, which would be 10 plus 10. But I mean, think about it. I mean, you want that risk to be represented as 0 because there are no little green men from Mars who are going to come over and, you know, kill everybody. But if you multiply those things together, if you go 10 times 0, then you have 0, and just intuitively that seems correct. So we can get more into sort of the theory of it, but I just want to make the point that it is incorrect, it is wrong, and you should never add hazard plus vulnerability to try and estimate risk. It needs to be multiplied. So here are just examples of some states where they added hazard and vulnerability. Here's an example of some places, states and provinces and countries where they used the multiplication. In some places like the UK, they took hazard exposure times vulnerability divided by coping capacity, which more people are doing now. And we can just kind of keep going down the list. Some of the equations started to get more complicated. So here we are seeing a set of, or a couple of incorrect formulas where they added it. A few states in there. This is what they call the CPRI score, Cumulative Probability Risk Index. I think that's what it stands for. And then they included weighting factors because everybody knows that some things are more important than others. They figured, well, we've got an equation. We want to incorporate the notion that some things are more important than other things. So let's put in a weighting factor of, say, probability times 0.45 and warning times 0.15 and duration times 0.1. But it's asked, where do those weightings come from? So we can acknowledge that, yes, everything is not of equal importance, but to create weightings like this is kind of like trying to calculate how many angels condense in the head of a pin. It really doesn't make any sense. And to compare the warning time by itself, without the context of the hazard, really adds a wild card in there. So take tornadoes, for example. You have a short warning time, and yes, that increases risk. And you might have a really long warning time for drought, but the prevention and mitigation strategies are just so different between those hazards that just to say warning time times 0.1 just makes the equations hard to understand. It's hard to understand what the equation, what it means. And the same issue exists for duration as well. Um, so here are a couple for Maine, Minnesota, Hawaii, and Michigan, where they treated it as if the hazard was normally distributed instead of following a power law. So here it's average annualized losses or the cost of future expected losses. That is only valid for normal distributions, but they applied that to a distribution which is far from normal. And so mathematically and statistically, it just makes no sense to do that. And here we have, here we have a bunch more places where they just use addition instead of multiplication, which means the formula is fundamentally incorrect. And so we come up with all these risk measures and we come up with all these formulas and present all these numbers. And this is not a scientific process in the sense that you're creating a hypothesis, you test your hypothesis and then validate it. So it's not that we create all these risk indices and then somehow we test them and go back and validate them. That never happens. That part never happens. The numbers just go out there. And many of the equations, it is very hard to understand what these numbers mean based on the kinds of equations and if they're even useful. And yet they are forming the basis for a lot of policy. So that's the point I'm trying to make here. To come up with a risk equation is kind of like a search for the Holy Grail, but there is no Holy Grail. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't be using statistics and mathematics and all that in terms of our understanding of risk. It is an important component of what we're doing, but it's not being done nearly rigorously enough. And too often it is thought of as being kind of the whole ball of wax. We just need to do this and then we're going to get a handle on risk. And in fact, it's only one component of understanding risk, and there are other important aspects of it as well. So my concluding thoughts are, and I'm sorry I've gone on too long, Dan, for this presentation. So risk analysis is an important tool that must be used by emergency management organizations for all kinds of important purposes. Like I'm a big advocate of risk analysis, but it's complicated. And it's underlain by values that need to be explicitly stated, by metrics that are used. They should be justified. There are traps in the process that people can fall into and organizations can fall into, and that we do fall into. And there's not a good understanding within our professional community of what those traps are and how to avoid them. And so I think there's just a lot of room within our community to just do a lot better in terms of risk analysis methodologies and how we do it. So that's the end of that presentation, Dan, and now you can take your shots at me.
No, I think it was great. There was a lot of great information. One of the question though that I have, and I know it's hard to answer, is what is stopping us from coming up with one, even though there's so many different ways to do it, and there's not one particular way, narrowing it down to where we are utilizing one universal way to do these assessments.
Yeah. So I think one big problem is the disconnect between practitioners and academics. And there's just a lot of the stuff that academics talk about and understand, it just doesn't cross over that boundary. And when people, like, let's say you work for the emergency management organization of XYZ, and you're an emergency manager, and say, we have to do a risk assessment. Okay, Dan, you're in charge. Okay, and a lot of people will have absolutely no background in risk assessment or very little. And so they say, what are we going to do? Well, let's do an environmental scan, right? Let's see what everybody else is doing. So they take a look at what everybody else is doing and they call it best practice. Oh man, how I hate that phrase. There are examples of best practice, and then there is common practice. And those are not the same things. And sometimes common practice is a far cry from best practice. But if you could say, everybody else is doing it this way, I'm going to do it the same way, like your ass is covered. And if you're not an expert in the field, if you haven't really studied it, you would not know that there are like fundamental problems there. So one of the problems is that many of the people who do risk assessments have been charged that task, but just don't have the background in that field to really understand the kind of traps you can fall into and the problems. And so anyway, so it's just propagating itself.
Yeah, well, I mean, I appreciate the presentation. A lot of good, great information. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to record it this way, so that people could go back and watch it as well. They can watch it, rewatch it, because of the quality of information that's there. And but I want to transition real quick to give you, because you did write a book, a great book. I've got multiple copies, one in my office and at home. So it's the ethical emergency manager. So I'd like to give you just a minute to talk about that and where people can go, and what I'll do as well with this summit, so everybody is aware. I will put the link to the Amazon purchase in the video area, so you could watch the video. And if you're interested in getting the book, you can click on the link, go get the book. But maybe do just a quick little plug for your book there before we say goodbye.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, the second edition is out now. And if you want to buy an e-copy of it through Amazon, it's only like $6 or $5.95. It's really cheap.
For a textbook is amazing.
Yeah, thank you. I think the hard copy is $20.
For $6 for a textbook is freaking amazing.
Well, I didn't want cost to be a barrier. I wrote it because I've been teaching ethics to emergency management students at the graduate level mostly, but undergraduate now for a number of years. And there was just no book out there that met our needs. So basically, I took my course notes and injected some steroids in them and tried to come up with a book that would be useful for the classes I teach, but hopefully also for practitioners, anybody who's interested in in this topic. I think it's a really important topic, and I would say the people I know who are emergency managers tend to have strong values. It's like the health community. They really are people who want to make a difference, who care about society and the vulnerable and so forth. But within our field, there hasn't been a strong, explicit educational component in it. So a lot of people haven't had the opportunity to take a course in ethics as it applies to emergency management. And emergency management, it is like ethics is ethics. It's a huge field. But there are some special characteristics of what we do that differentiate it from just ethics applied more generally. And so that's what I've tried to do. Take the sort of broad overview of ethics and say, okay, this is how it applies to emergency managers. So I've tried to make the book a mixture of theory and practice, so it would be useful to people who are interested in both sides of it.
Very good. Yeah, it's great. I recommend it to everybody. Like I said, I have 2 copies. So I have one in my office and one at home as well, in my home office. So it's a great book. I also wanted to, so where can people find you? I know, so you're Professor Etkin is a professor at York University. So where can they find you if they want to make contact or reach out?
Well, my email is etkin@yorku.ca. So just send me an email. If you just Google my name, I'm an easy find. Put in David Etkin, York University, I'll pop up. You'll see.
And I'll be sharing, and just for everybody's awareness, I'll be sharing this information in the summit notes as well. So underneath the video, you should have access to Dr. Etkin's notes and the link to purchase his book and his contact information. So I just want to thank you, Dr. Etkin, for spending the time to give us this presentation. A lot of great information, a lot of great resources as well. Time is the most valuable thing that you can give to anybody, and I appreciate you giving us some today. So just thank you very much for this presentation.
Okay, it's been my pleasure, as always. Have a great day, Dan.
You too.